Welcome everyone to Regarding Men, where we hold men in high regard and where red pill isolation comes to die. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, go to regardingmen.com/join and you'll figure it out, because we'd love to have you there. Anyway, tonight I'm, as always, with Paul Elam of paulelam.com and Janice Fiamingo, who does the Fiamingo Files. And we're here to talk about a wonderful piece of research that's done by James Nuzzo. James is now living in Australia, I think. Is that right, James? Or do you prefer Jim?
Either one is fine.
Good.
Whatever you feel most comfortable with. I'm in Perth, Western Australia.
Yes, very good. And Jim has done some research on men's health that is just wonderful stuff. I mean, he's done it in a way that is simple, it's elegant, and it's irrefutable. You can't refute it. It's just solid stuff that now can be taken. We can show this research to legislators, to educators, to the media. And really, once we get finished talking about it tonight, you're going to understand why I like it so much and why I think it's going to be an important piece of research. So with that in mind, and Janice and Paul and I and a lot of people have been writing this stuff for a while. The whole bias thing and the percentages thing. And sometimes it feels like we're writing to deaf ears, because we're kind of singing to the crowd that already knows. But this is different, because what Jim has done can be sent out to different places. So anyway, Jim, I wanted to start off asking you a question, and that is, what moved you to do this particular study?
So it's a drawn-out story. I'm not sure if you want to...
We got time, man.
Yes, we got time.
Go right ahead. We like stories.
My background is not in men's health. It's not in epidemiology. It's not in psychology. My background is in exercise science or exercise physiology. Oh. So this is quite a different topic for me. But how this all happened was via a paper that got published in a prominent exercise science journal. So I'll make the connections for you here.
Yeah.
What the paper was concerned about was this notion of creating equity in physical activity. And so what I mean by that is if you send out a survey to a large number of people in your country and you have them fill it out, ask them questions about how physically active they are, you get the responses back, and then you put people into all these different groupings based on their sex or gender, based on their race, based on their disability status, their education level. What you find is that not all groups of people are as physically active as other groups of people.
Right.
And so the main organization in the US dealing with matters related to exercise science sees these differences, they call them inequities, as a major problem. And their goal was they published a position paper that they wanted to achieve equity in physical activity to achieve health equity. And what they mean in all this is creating equal outcomes. Mm-hmm. So they want the physical activity rates to be the same between all the groups. And then as a consequence of that, because we know physical activity is beneficial for your health and function, they hope to also then make the health outcomes equal. So now getting to the sex and gender part of it. There is a push right now in my field to really focus in on women and females and getting them more physically active. And the reason is because when you do these types of surveys, in most countries, women are less physically active than men. So automatically they conclude, oh, this is due to bias against women, this is due to discrimination, sexism, and that's that whole story. And then they design these initiatives and publish all these papers saying, oh, we've got to focus in on women. But the interesting thing to this is that if you're actually trying to create more equal health outcomes, it would make more sense to focus on the men, even though they have higher levels of activity on average. And so I pointed out this failure to them. So I've published a big paper on this, not just on the sex part, but the bigger picture philosophy that they have taken with this whole initiative and demonstrated why it just doesn't make any sense. And in the process of sort of refuting the whole sex and gender thing, where my view is just to focus on everyone, why do you have to focus on one sex or another? In doing that, I got into the little sort of men's health literature there was, because all I needed was just like a simple review paper of some kind that summarized the data, some government report that I could cite that might explain why there's this mortality difference and so on. And I just couldn't find a source that put all of those data like into one report. And I found that to be very, very odd once I started to learn more about it. Because like I said, I was very naive. I've sort of told myself a couple years ago, I don't even think I knew that there was a mortality difference between men and women. If you were to have asked me, I don't think I would have even known that. Right. And then once you start to get into the data more, you're like, my goodness, how has no one, if this were to have happened to any other demographic group, these numbers would be stacked up this way. We would have initiative after initiative, government office over here and over there. Yeah. And it became a bit of a side project for me because I know that I have the skills to publish in academic journals. So it was a bit of a risk for me to go on and do this, but it has actually helped me to create sort of a bigger story with some of the side projects I'm doing. So that is the long-winded story of how I got into men's health.
Fascinating tale. And have you gotten any blowback, negative blowback for this? Or has it been positive?
No, well, I think there is one woman on Twitter who I was going at it with a little bit on the physical activity stuff. Yeah. I think she has sort of tweeted out a couple of things, but that's about it. And I've had a couple of people in the men's health area sort of reach out to me. John Barry, who I think you had on your show not too long ago.
Yes.
I've connected with him, and a couple of others as well.
Yeah, Ron Henry, I think, was connected with
you.
Yeah, good.
Yep.
Good.
Well, good for you.
It's hard to, I don't know, maybe if you don't like the tone in my writing or something, maybe you could sort of say that, but the epidemiological data are irrefutable. It's mostly government data that I cite from the CDC or some other agency. So the numbers are the numbers.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I admire you for having the integrity to follow it through. Yes. Because I think a lot of researchers could merely sort of put a finger up to the wind and realize that the fact that there isn't much out there on this subject maybe indicates that there isn't a lot of interest in this subject, and that it seems as if all of the attention is focused in the other way, as you pointed out, towards women and what more we need to do to make sure that women exercise and women feel good about themselves, and resources go to making women self-confident about exercising or whatever the popular narrative happens to be. I'm always amazed at the ability of people in our culture to come up with yet more reasons to put more resources into, some sort of public campaign, because supposedly it's just so difficult for women to go out and take a long walk or go for a jog or sign up on the tennis court or whatever it happens to be. And we need to all, do this big public thing to make that possible for them. So yeah, I really thank you for following this through. And I wonder if you could explain for our listeners how you structured your study, and I know that you really focus on this health paradox, as you call it. Could you explain for our listeners what that is and what you found in your study?
So there's two portions to the paper. The first one is just sort of a review paper or review section. And what I did was I came up with a list of health outcomes to sort of look into the epidemiological data to see if there are differences between men and women on the prevalence rate. So how many people in your population, in your country, and by the way, this is focused mostly on the United States data, but a lot of the health outcomes will be the same way in most countries. So yeah, just going through the epidemiological literature, trying to find other sort of review papers. I relied on the CDC data quite a lot. They put out what is it? It's sort of a weekly newsletter, but it is a proper sort of publication with solid data in it. So I came up with a list of health outcomes that were more prevalent. So these are, when I say more prevalent, I mean it's not a good thing that they're more prevalent in men than women. I did not present the other side of the story, which is that there are many health outcomes that are more prevalent in women than in men as well. But of course, as I think I stated in my paper in the discussion, there are all sorts of national offices to distribute and disseminate that information, and I'm not going to use up part of my paper dedicated to that. So I focused only on the men's issues. So I just created a big table that had all that different outcomes listed, and then the prevalence rates for all of those different outcomes. And then the second part of the paper was, and I don't actually know how I came up with this idea, what sort of instigated it, but I started to get this feeling that people just weren't really interested in men's health as sort of a general field of potential study. Whereas I just felt like I continually saw the word women's health popping up over and over again. Yeah. And it just didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So I did a very, very basic, simple thing. And the main biomedical research databases is called PubMed. And PubMed is actually run through the CDC, and it indexes or archives millions of research articles and papers. And when you search through the database, it can be very powerful because you are searching through so many documents. And all I did was a search for the terms men's health and women's health in either the title or the abstracts of papers, to just get a sense for like how interested in these two fields are people. And because all we hear is, there's not enough attention given to sort of women's issues and women's health. Well, it turns out when you just, and anyone can go and do this search, you type those words into the search bar, you get something like 1,500 results for the word men's health appearing in either the title or abstract of the paper, and you get somewhere around 15,000 results for the term women's health. So
sorry, James, this was articles published, am I remembering correctly, was it from 1971, something like that, or am I making that up?
Yeah, so I think the years that I searched was 1970 to 2018, okay. Maybe. And the reason for starting at 1970, I think that was just because prior to that, maybe there was just some inconsistencies and like some of the years there might not be anything for me to report or something. Because PubMed, that database, it indexes things published prior, but it started, I think, in the 1960s. So it doesn't archive very well the earlier stuff.
Yeah.
Right.
But the stuff that was sort of published after it was created, particularly the past couple of decades, it indexes them very well and very accurately. So that's why it went from 1970 to 2018. So how I've interpreted this result is that I think women's health has sort of become like a bit of a catchphrase in a way. And I think people have created, I don't know, two different concepts. Or like women's health has become its own field of study, but men's health really hasn't. It's just sort of like this random little bits and pieces. So it's not that men are not necessarily being studied, they are. It's just that the way that it's framed, I think, is quite different. And I think this is me just speculating here, but I wonder if that tag term, women's health, is actually being used as an extra boost to something that doesn't actually have a lot of legitimacy to begin with. And what I mean by that is, of course, we're all concerned about women's health and men's health, but it might be trying to overcome the fact that it's actually men that in general have worse health outcomes. So they give it a bit of a boost by sort of using this tag phrase that, oh yeah, women's health. So that's a bit of speculation, but I do think people, because I have now, I've got another paper that's under review dealing with this at an international level at the World Health Organization and the United Nations, and the same finding happens in their databases. So I think, yeah, I think it needs to be looked into a bit more how specific words are being used in this whole area.
Yes. And if we could back up just a second, I want people to realize that the parts that you talked about, the first part of just indexing the percentages, that's a long list. It's a long list, and it includes things that I've never even thought of. Hearing loss is more male than female. Drowning, more male than female. Check out the list. I mean, it's really fascinating, but it's overwhelming, you know. And then you go and you see the PubMed data, where it's 10 times as much interest in the phrase of women's health than men's health, and it just leaves you scratching your head, which was, you know, your title of your article was Men's Health in the U.S., a National Health Paradox, which I think describes the whole thing perfectly. It's a paradox. I mean, here we've got men who are in need, but women get the attention, you know? Yeah. So kudos.
I'm curious if at any point during doing all this, if you found yourself challenged in your own belief systems, your own understanding of men's health or how we look at men's versus women's health, are there any biases that got challenged in you?
Not necessarily. I'm a pretty sort of open, alternative thinker, and I just sort of make up my own independent decisions. So I usually don't go along with the crowd too often when it comes to these sorts of academic things. This is the same in my more specific exercise science research as well. Over the years, for example, I'd read the book by Roy Baumeister. Can't remember the title of that.
What are men good for? Is it that one, or something about what are men good for? Is that right? The one you're thinking of? I can't remember the exact title, but
I think that's it, Janice.
Yeah.
So that one I read a couple of years ago, which was, I think, probably my first introduction to the whole sort of men's health stuff, I guess. But subsequently, like around the time I was doing this paper, I read Christina Hoff Sommers' book, Boy Crisis, I think is the name of it, for the education.
The War Against Boys.
War Against Boys, yes. So, yeah, I've always been fairly open to some of these ideas. And really, as much as I'm interested in men's health, what actually concerns me more is the feminist narratives and sort of the epistemology associated with feminism, which is a sort of very anti-science. Maybe they use science when it's convenient for them, but in general, it's a very sort of subjective type of epistemology. And I just think that traverses all areas, all domains. Yeah. And it's really that, and that's why I sort of form it as the paradox, right? So the paradox is the fact that you have this narrative in all this attention towards women's health, but the reality is that if you're interested in helping one sex or the other, well, it's actually men who on average have these worse health outcomes. Yeah. And that paradox just points to the sort of the issues with the feminist narrative, which is really more fundamentally what I'm concerned about.
Well, first, my congratulations for having beaten the odds on blowback.
Well, they probably just haven't figured me out yet. They haven't.
That could be it.
That's also What you've done is irrefutable. You can't refute it. It's not something that's opinion. It's just you put the facts down in a way that's very convincing. And
well, one thing I think that I can imagine a feminist responding and attacking you for is the feminist response to that extraordinary number that you can find articles on women's health at a 10 times higher rate than you can find articles on men's health. The feminist response to that is going to be that that's because, now exactly how would they put it? They'd say it was because health studies is male health studies. So they're going to say that anytime you have a non-gender specified kind of health study, it's going to be geared towards men, because men are the gender neutral, representative of humanity, whereas women are always seen as the sex. They're the gendered group of people. So they're going to claim that your result is misleading in that there probably are a whole bunch of studies that mainly focus on men. They just don't necessarily have men in the title. Because that's always they always have some way of finding that women have been discriminated against. Right. Do you have a response to that kind of criticism? I bet you've already thought about it.
Yeah, I guess I've got two. So one is that I try to be a bit careful with my wording in the paper, which is that I'm saying that I think they've been sort of, men's health and women's health has been sort of conceptualized. One has been conceptualized and the other one hasn't, or something. Like there's this whole field of study, whereas for men's health it's not, or else people would be using that term over and over again.
Right.
But on the more specific claim of what this is sort of getting at is representation of male and female participants in research. I think that's where they might come at it a little bit.
Right.
And that narrative has been going on for a long time. I mean, I discuss it in the introduction of my paper about this notion that females are underrepresented as participants in research trials. So the first thing I'll say off the bat is even if evidence comes to be that they are, maybe it's because it's actually them that have better health outcomes, and so they're less in need of attention in clinical trials. That would be my first response. So maybe, like, why does there need to be 50-50 representation in the first place? Just, right. I mean, most outcomes in life are not sort of equally distributed amongst demographic groups. Thomas Sowell has published numerous books on this over the years. Yeah. So that would be the first thing I'd say to that. But then that narrative of female underrepresentation. So in the United States, that started in the 1980s, and there was this concern that there were less women in clinical trials. So what happened was they created a National Women's Office for Research on Women's Health within the NIH. They passed legislation in the US that established this office amongst several other offices dedicated towards women's health. Then in 1994, someone actually got around to looking at it properly. The Institute of Medicine, which I think is a nonpartisan sort of think tank, and what they found, so they generated this report on women's health, and part of it was dedicated to this underrepresentation issue. Well, what the report found was that there was no difference in representation. It just depended on which topic you were studying. Sometimes men were studied more, sometimes women were studied more. But it was too late. The legislation had already passed. The offices were already established. The offices still exist to this day at taxpayer expense. They still put out the same sort of narrative. When it was initially created, if you go back and look at the publications from the head of that office in the early 90s, there's a quote in there of, like, quote, widespread exclusion of women in clinical trials. And it just wasn't true. And then on top of all that, in the legislation, they included, as you might expect with policy, they threw in a couple of extra things. So we want to get more women in biomedical research fields and these sorts of things.
No.
I have since become more interested in this narrative of underrepresentation of participants in research because it's now coming into exercise science. There have been a couple of papers published on it in the past couple of years. And the interesting thing is you can actually download the NIH National Institutes of Health data on the Office for Research in Women's Health website. And it actually shows that there's no difference. They have the data on their own website. If anything, there's more female participants. In exercise science, it's a little bit different. Well, at least the studies that have been done so far, that there's more male participants. But the problem is that you cannot use cross-sectional data to infer the cause. So what is happening in exercise science is that they're saying, look, there's more male-only studies than female-only studies. And this is due to discrimination or bias against women. But you cannot use cross-sectional differences to infer the cause of those differences. You actually have to measure the potential cause. And what they're not accounting for are things like the fact that men on average will have different health outcomes. They'll be affected by different conditions. In the realm of sports and exercise, men are generally more interested in sports and exercise. Yeah. These are things that, this is what I'm saying, it's a very sort of anti-science sort of thing. Yeah. They have their narrative and bias already, and they're going to try to ram it down your throat without any further discussion. And I want some more discussion.
All right.
Good for you.
I think touching on the underrepresentation meme again too, this has gone, and I did some reading on this myself, and I think it's true that for some time during the 1940s and 50s, that when it came to clinical trials on drugs, they were using more men. A lot of that was using convicts and men in the military, men who were seen as more expendable, and Warren Bell wrote about that later and basically brought out, yes, they did more research with these drugs on men than women for the same reason they did more research on rats than human beings. And this was taken, the feminist narrative is to take that over-representation, the representation actually of risk that was assumed by men, and calling that misogyny or somehow a bias against women.
Right.
Yeah, it's unbelievable how they turn the narratives. I mean, it's relative for exercise science as well, because a lot of, or some of the initial research into this was done on astronauts who, would have been primarily males, and they're getting all sorts of things poked and prodded in them. In exercise science, we do some pretty invasive things. We stimulate people's nerves. We take muscle biopsies sometimes. And I've had a paper it got rejected. It was quite interesting, the reviews I got back about, in at least in exercise science, we need to consider something that's called volunteer bias. And all volunteer bias means is that not all people want to participate in research studies, and it's possible that different, on the average, people of different, sexes or, demographic groups might be more or less likely to want to participate. And this is fairly well described in the sexes, that there is this difference to willingness to participate in certain types of experiments. And I have been trying to convince my colleagues of this, but my paper got it rejected from the first journal it went to. By the way, one of the reviewers, it was the worst review I've ever seen in my entire life. And I can tell that it was from a sort of a feminist sort. Mm-hmm. And basically what she admitted was that she didn't read my paper. She only read the abstract and the title, and it had a very provocative title. And what she said was, and again, I'm assuming that this is a woman. I don't actually know for sure. I got to be clear about that. But what she said was that perceptions trump data. And I've been in these gender battles for a long time. It was something about that. But at the end of her little short description was, it doesn't matter what you say, my perceptions trump your data. And that is exactly what I'm trying to push back against.
Yes.
And
yes.
I tried to get this appealed, this decision appealed.
Mm-hmm.
The journal still rejected it at the end of the day, but they did give it some initial consideration. But this is why it's really important, because now it's going to be, harder to get these viewpoints out there, because some of these people are reviewing papers, and as I explained to the editor of the journal, I said, this individual should not be allowed to review papers, because this is a scientific journal. It's like one of the major scientific journals in exercise science. I said, this person has no business reviewing scientific data. They don't appreciate it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. No, she should be disqualified
Quickly
on the basis of her response to your paper alone. Anybody who would admit, first of all, that she didn't even read your paper in order to reject it or recommend that the paper not be published, and then to say anything about how data is less relevant than perception, and her lived experience somehow trumps whatever evidence you're bringing forward. I mean, that means that this person is literally incapable of objectively evaluating the quality of your paper. And she has no business reviewing, but it's quite likely that the journal itself has some kind of diversity policy that's been forced on it through years of feminist lobbying, that it has to have a woman on the board, or a woman amongst the reviewers. And so the fact that they happen to get a feminist ideologue who is going to feel really good about rejecting any paper that doesn't peddle feminist ideology is just an unfortunate fact of these kinds of diversity initiatives. So wow, that's
and the journal itself took the hit on its intellectual integrity.
Yes, they did.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Wow, that's it'll be worth if you keep going in this direction of doing research on men's health and pushing back against the encroachment of feminist ideology. It'll be worth keeping the rejection letters that you might receive and all the kinds of responses, because that would make an interesting paper in itself one day.
Good point. Good point.
That's right. I may actually put that particular. The reviewer only gave me a few sentences, which again is evidence that they didn't read it properly. But I might put it up on Twitter. I was waiting for the appeal process to sort of finish up, but I'm still not sure if I'm going to put it up. But I think people need to be aware. And again, as I said, this is one of the major journals in our field.
Wow,
it's amazing. It's amazing. And they're doing the same thing to physics and the hard sciences too. They're trying to,
Yeah. So this is essentially what is happening. Again, I frame this in exercise science because that's what I'm involved in. But in exercise science, I think what's happening is a lot of this is coming through public health, which sort of has like one foot in the humanities and another foot sort of in like the sciences or like epidemiology. Yeah. And I sort of view public health as like the bridge that's carrying over the rubbish in the humanities over into like sciences and exercise science. That's what I see.
You're probably right. Yeah. Are you planning any other articles on men's health?
Other than the one there's one that's under review right now.
Yeah.
That is and I sent it to Tom, just the abstract.
It's a thing of beauty.
It is indeed.
It really is. And I forgot to forward that to Janice and to Paul. That's my mistake. But can we put that?
I can outline it if you want me to.
Can we put that abstract up to let people see? Or is that something that needs to be?
Hold off on it for now, just because
Okay.
it's still under review, and the abstract will probably change when I get the reviewer comments
Let us
back.
know.
Another abstract. I read one that you
Yeah.
sent.
Yeah. Well, the one on men's health is there, and that one I'm sure it's okay to put the abstract up.
Okay.
Yes, the paper that's the
yes.
full-length paper that's in the journal Aging Male. That's okay.
Yes. Yes.
This other paper that's under review right now is essentially looking at this particular paradox that I mentioned in my paper, but at an international level. So what I focus in on is the World Health Organization and the United Nations. So the WHO is the health branch of the UN. And if you're active on Twitter at all, and Janice, you probably see things that come out of the UN Women's Twitter feed.
Oh, yeah.
That it's quite a horrendous Twitter feed. Like some of the stuff that they put out, it's like it's run by a bunch of, fifth graders or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, COVID isn't killing enough men. Well, that wasn't quite it, but there was something by this woman who was major UN person talking about how there was some poetic justice to the fact that domestic violence rates had supposedly exploded during the lockdown as a result of COVID-19, but there was a God after all, because these same men were being killed at a much higher rate. And, she did eventually delete this tweet, but, this idea that, there was justice because men were dying at twice the number, because all those men, of course, are wife beaters, as we know. I mean, the level of thinking, the prideful bias that they exhibit, their man hatred, is just astounding.
Yes.
So following that Twitter feed got me motivated to do this next paper. It was one of the motivations. And it became apparent to me as I would do more searching that there was a big bias within the UN and the WHO. And the WHO is very influential on public health, and then consequently on exercise science,
right,
and some of the things that I've written about before. So I've got an interest in what they're up to. And there are some things that are very, very obvious. So for example, if you go on Twitter and you look for UN Twitter feeds related to women's health or men's health, you will find big fat zero when it comes to men. The UN Women Twitter feed, the main one, a lot of people know about that, but there's also, I think I calculated or found there's like 60 some other ones. So ones associated with different countries. They don't put out as much info, but the whole, okay, so what we need to take a step back here. The UN and WHO are in part taxpayer funded by member states. So the United States, I'm a US citizen, so my taxes contribute to the UN and to the WHO. So there's this huge bias on Twitter, for example, and you can quantify that. You can just say, here's the number of Twitter feeds dedicated towards women's health, and here's, for men's health. Another thing, international days of observance. The UN has a list of international days of observance. You can use the scientometric. So basically what I'm doing is I'm taking these things that people might think, okay, yeah, that's pretty obvious, but I put numbers to them. So I go through, I get their list, and I say, what percentage of their days are dedicated to like a gender or sex issue? And then how many of those are dedicated toward women and how many are dedicated toward men? And it turns out they've got 9 international days dedicated toward women in some way. They've got 0 dedicated to men. The day that's meant to be International Men's Day is World Toilet Day.
Heard that, yeah, God.
And then when you think about it even further, I mean, some of the other things that they're recognizing on their international days, different like languages, space exploration. They have 2 days where they recognize themselves. The UN has 2 international days recognizing themselves, and not a single day about men's health. So I point this out in the paper. And then I go on, and then I go into their databases. So the UN and the WHO each have databases where they archive all of the information, all the reports that they generate. And this is really important because these are reports that they generate. So they are the causal agents responsible for this information. And when you go through and you use keyword searches like men's health, women's health, or just type in the word men, women, boys, girls, male, female, you just see an enormous difference. Like, it is not even close. It's the same. It's the second half of that paper that you've all seen, the women's health and men's health number of times used. It's the same thing at these organizations. It's even worse because you know that they are the direct causal agents responsible for the materials in their archives. Yeah. The UN's Sustainable Development Goals, which are very catchy now in different sorts of public health publications, there's 17 of these development goals. One of them is dedicated toward gender equality. It has absolutely nothing to do with men at all. It's all focused on women. So I just go through and I list all of these things to point out this bias. And I hope now, I think what it does is it sort of confirms, I think, some of the experimental psychology work that's coming out, which sort of, I think these national and international level biases might be the manifestations of individual level psychological biases, where if you present research participants with different scenarios, they might be more likely to save the woman, for example. Mm-hmm. So I do think there is a connection, and I think it's important to acknowledge that it exists, the bias, because it might actually tell us something about our fundamental human nature.
Yeah, you're talking about gamma bias, right?
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. That's potent, and I'm sure it's involved.
Yep.
Yeah, it sounds like you're a one-man army, James.
And Jim, please keep focusing on men. What, Paul?
No, yeah, but the thing is, like, I'm not paid to do this research. In fact, I've been I'm now doing some casual work for one of the universities nearby, but I'm paid to do neurophysiology of exercise research. So this is all happening in my spare time.
Oh, jeez.
So if you know anyone that wants to hire me to do this more properly and more consistently,
what would it cost?
Yeah. By all means,
what would it cost?
What's that?
What would it cost?
What would it cost?
Yeah.
Look, I'm about doing what makes me happy and what I'm passionate about. I'm not too worried about the figures. We can discuss it off there, man.
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, it's so important because
it really is.
As Tom said at the beginning of our discussion, like to have studies like yours. I know it takes hours and hours and hours, hundreds of hours of painstaking work to be able to codify all this stuff, say, here's the numbers. I looked through all these pages of data and, this is what I came up with. It's backbreaking work, and it's so incredibly useful to be able to point to that study and say, it's not just my imagination that there's this bias. This isn't just based on this one tweet or a few random encounters. It's incredible. And to think of you doing this, I didn't realize that this was not really your area. Wow. I mean, that makes it even more exciting and admirable that you've done it. So thanks a lot.
I second that.
And these biases, they cost lives.
Yeah.
Yes, they do.
I mean, this is really important work. I hope you do find some funding to continue this.
Yeah.
But it's unlikely, because the funding out there for men is almost non-existent.
Yeah, well,
if you wanted to study women, you'd be
it rains money,
barrels of cash. Oh,
Yeah,
jeez.
unfortunately, yeah.
Or if you want to study why men's problems are men's fault, you can.
Maybe that might be the way to do it. You could frame the study in terms of patriarchy theory or something to get something from one of the academic funding bodies and make it look as if it was going to come out that it had a kind of feminist bias to it, but then turn around and do it.
How patriarchy kills kittens.
Yeah. I don't know, but yeah, it's true. It's hard to get funding for that kind of thing, but it's so incredibly important.
We're about ready to finish up. And Jim, is there anything that we've left out? Anything you wanted to say that before we stop?
No, I think that pretty much covers it. I'm glad you guys are doing the interviews and the work that you're doing.
Thank you for doing this and
really
what you've done. It's greatly appreciated. I know
really
hear that from a lot of people, but in these circles, it's very, very much appreciated.
Really. So you've quickly become one of my favorite researchers.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. Oh man, my heart goes with you.
What's that?
What?
That men
are. They're good.
Men are good. As are you.
That's the end.
Take care, folks.
All right, we'll see you then.
Thanks.